friends. It's great to have you, and welcome to my series on the Sacred Book of John. Thank you for listening. We've now reached the Cain and Abel story, which is Genesis 4. And the Cain and Abel story begins with the exile of Adam and Eve from the garden. In our last episode, Eve was created, and Adam recognized his own spiritual co-essence. And the story of Eve is continued because the counterpunch of the creator is to create two archons that will rule the earthly elements as his deputies. And these two archons are created from Eve herself. Now Yaldabaoth knew that they, meaning Adam and Eve, withdrew from him. He vigorously cursed them. He appropriated Adam's wife by his domination of her. He did not know the mystery which took place in the holy judgment on high. This is straight from Genesis. There is no question that the Creator curses people. The vigorous curse perhaps alludes to the threefold curse in Genesis 3:16 to 19. Adam and Eve's withdrawal from the Creator comes from Genesis 3:8, where they quite literally hide from him. They fear him. This is not the true God. That can be read right out of Genesis. Now, most translations understand Yaldabaoth as granting domination to Adam over his wife, and this is in accord with Genesis 3:16, where it is said that he, meaning Adam, will rule over you, Eve. But in my view, the only dominator here is Yaldabaoth himself, as will soon become clear when he rapes Eve. They, meaning Adam and Eve, were afraid to insult Yaldabaoth to reveal his ignorance to his angels. Then he threw them from paradise. He clothed them with thick darkness. The exile from paradise is a literal reading of Genesis 3:24, where the Creator throws Adam and Eve out so that they do not eat from the tree of life and live forever. But that won't work exactly here, because the tree of life is, in fact, Yaldabaoth's tree, according to the Sacred Book of John. Whoever wrote the Sacred Book of John does appear to be familiar with Hebrew and with Hebrew interpretation or rabbinic interpretation of Genesis 3:24. It is said that the Creator clothed Adam with skins, which is the Hebrew word or, which has a double entendre depending on how it's spelled, whether with an aleph or with an ayin. And or with an aleph means light, with an ayin it means skin. So when you heard this text, you didn't know which one was which unless you saw it with your eyes. The idea that the Creator clothed Adam and Eve with light was a tradition carried on in rabbinic texts. But this author quite deliberately reverses that tradition with the opinion that the Creator, logically given his character, hardly clothes Adam with light. That would not even make sense given the narrative. He has, after all, just exiled them. It makes much better sense that he clothed them with thick darkness. And in fact, Yahweh is said to exist in thick darkness himself. Then he, meaning Yaldabaoth, saw the virgin attending Adam. Yaldabaoth was full of ignorance. He was wanting to have children from her. He defiled her. He fathered his first child, and likewise the second, Yahweh the bare-faced, and Elohim the cat-faced. Here again we have evidence that the author of the Sacred Book of John knew Hebrew, because he uses the Hebrew names for God as he appears in Genesis 2 and 3. This God is Yahweh Elohim. And Julius Bellhausen in the late 19th century famously distinguished the J after Yahweh and the E source in Genesis after Elohim. The author of the Secret Book of John does something similar. He sees Yahweh and Elohim as the two powers of Yaldabaoth, and he has his own version of how these two powers came to be. According to him, the first man, so to speak, to have sex with Eve was not Adam, but Yaldabaoth. Technically, this interpretation contradicts Genesis 4:1, where Adam knew his wife. But it does have an exegetical basis because it's interpreting Eve saying in the same verse, I've obtained a human through the Lord being Yaldabaoth. In other words, Adam may have known his wife, but it's the Lord who had sex with her. And sex between Yaldabaoth and Eve was something in the tradition. The idea that Cain was fathered by someone else other than Adam was traditional. Usually that someone else was the devil, but it was logical for the author of the secret book of John to give that role to Yaldabaoth. He is the institutor of sex and sexual desire, and his defilement of Eve is his having sex with her, and it's evident that it should be considered rape because there is no hint of Eve's consent. At any rate, this happens twice so that Eve bears two children. Yaldabaoth already had children to rule the sky, whom we've met as the seven planetary authorities. He needed children to rule the earth and the four elements that make up the material bodies. So he produced Cain and Abel, or according to their true names, Yahweh and Elohim. Yahweh takes on the unjust character of Cain and is unjust, and Elohim takes on the just character of Abel. Yahweh's other children had animal forms, so it's no surprise that Yahweh and Elohim have animal faces. Yahweh is the bear-faced, and Elohim is the cat-faced. Elohim takes control, as we learn, of the upper elements, namely fire and air, and Yahweh, subordinate to him, rules the lower elements, earth and water. One is just, the other unjust. Elohim is just, Yahweh unjust. The just one was established over fire and air, the unjust one over earth and water. All generations call them Abel and Cain. I find it interesting that we have a split into the just God here, Elohim, and an unjust God, Yahweh. I think this might reflect debates among Marcionite and Valentinian Christians. Whereas Valentinian Christians generally viewed the Creator as just, Marcion and many of his followers viewed him as evil. Basically, the Sethians solved the problem by distinguishing two figures to rule the earth, one just, the other unjust, who are the twin powers of Yaldabaoth. The idea that the Creator has two powers is an idea that resonates with rabbinic tradition, and it goes all the way back to Philo, who distinguishes both powers as good and kingly. In this modification of the Cain and Abel story, it no longer makes sense to have Cain kill Abel. Focus is on Yaldabaoth's act of defilement and the products of that defilement. Yaldabaoth is the first to have sex with Eve. Sex is not something that Adam did with Eve. Eve was a virgin with Adam. Sex does not appear to be natural to the world. It was established by the first ruler, Yaldabaoth, who, as we will see, will sow that same sexual desire eventually into Adam. Till this day, sex was instituted and perpetuated by the first ruler. He sowed in Adam the lust for reproducing, so that from this nature the rulers sowed their likeness through their counterfeit spirit. I think reading this, it's hard to say that the author of the Secret Book of John approved of sex, of any sex. And I say this with some hesitation because there was this praise of Adam when he saw Eve for the first time. He was awakened and he said that she is bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, and that the two shall become one flesh. I don't think, given the logic of the text, that that can mean that they will have literal sex, because in effect, Adam never has sex with Eve until sex is instituted and perpetuated by Yaldabaoth, who was here the first ruler. Sex has to be secondarily, or rather, sexual desire has to be secondarily sewed into Adam, so that from his nature, from this nature, the rulers sowed their likeness through the counterfeit spirit. I think this is one of the counterattacks of the archons. They want sex because they want the light power to be spread out. If you can spread it out, you can weaken it. I think that's what's going on here. The idea of the rulers sowing their likeness through the counterfeit spirit is something that will become clear later, because the rulers are able to produce other humans by essentially doing the same thing that Yaldabaoth has already done, having sex with human women, and then having children and lineages that are ruled and controlled by their counterfeit spirit, as opposed to the lineage that is controlled by luminous insight and the light power. The two rulers were assigned over dominions so that they would rule the cave. Adam realized his own lawless impulse. He fathered Seth according to the model of the higher family among the eternities. Now, Seth is obviously a positive figure for Sethians. He is the forefather of the redeemed, the heroic ancestor. But the fact that Adam fathered Seth by having sex is not, it seems, entirely positive. Adam does not come to know Eve, but rather his lawlessness. That is Adam's own lawless impulse, which refers to sexual desire, at least as I understand it. Admittedly, Seth appears according to the model of the heavenly family, but his mode of coming into this world is not lauded. It's an important part in the plan of salvation. But if salvation had been up to Adam, there wouldn't have been a proliferation of the light power in the first place. And there wouldn't be us, essentially. But there is us. And so there are different families upon the earth. I won't say different races, because the issue here is it's never said that, one person can't go into another family. We are part of a family by means of our own choice, and we're not fated or predetermined. And we will get to this theme in a future session, but just to foreshadow it here, I insist on translating the Sethians as the immovable family. And I insist on understanding the family as something that you joined by choice. It does have something to do with your nature, but everyone who is a child of Adam has a spiritual nature. The difference with the seed of Seth is just that they also have luminous insight, which makes them aware of their true nature.